we have reached the final talk of this, the first session of the second day of Giving and Asking for Reasons. As you can see, we have Marlene Meyer et al., represented by Marlene Meyer of the University of Göttingen, and please take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here and to be presenting an empirical study that I conducted with my colleagues from Göttingen, Marina Prof, Lydia Hradec, and Hannes Rakoczi, as well as with Jan Engelmann from UC Berkeley. And we were interested in young children's metacognitive abilities in a social context. So I want to talk about communicating uncertainty today. So this did work previously. All right. So this is my agenda. I would already like to point out that the main idea is that metacognition reveals itself most clearly in a social context. So before I will present our empirical approach, I want to give you an overview of what we know about metacognitive development in general, and then shift the focus onto the social perspective on that. All right. So first off, what do I mean when I talk about metacognition? I'm sorry, I'm just going to stand here. So what do I mean when I talk about metacognition? Well, in the broadest sense, metacognition can be described as cognition about cognition. But for today, of course, we need to narrow this down, and I want to focus on one single metacognitive ability, which is the ability to understand and to reflect on one's own epistemic states. And this can involve metacognitive insight into one's own states of knowledge, as well as ignorance. So we're talking about knowing, or knowing about not knowing, if you like. Also, I would like to introduce a distinction made in several works or theories on metacognition, which is procedural versus declarative metacognition. This follows the tradition, or this is refers to this famous distinction between declarative and procedural memory, and also follows the tradition of distinguishing the procedural nature of knowing how versus the declarative nature of knowing that. So what follows is that procedural metacognition involves mostly implicit forms of epistemic insight, and declarative metacognition is the more explicit form and like factual knowledge about one's own states of knowledge. All right. So what do we know about metacognitive development? When do procedural and declarative metacognition emerge? Well, when we look at procedural metacognition, we see that very young children show sensitivity to their own epistemic states. For example, 2 to 3-year-old children engage in so-called information search. That is that they keep looking for more information when they're still ignorant about something. Other experimental paradigms show this early sensitivity too. So when the children are allowed to opt out, that is, like not respond and move on to the next question or the next trial, well, then 2 to 3-year-old children skip those difficult trials or ask for help. I want to just draw your attention to this study by Kim and colleagues, where they found that 3-year-old children, for example, refrained from informing another person when they themselves were ignorant. All right. Now, these early human findings are also supported by comparative literature. So we see, for example, that rhesus monkeys and rats decline difficult trials too. So they show a similar pattern of these opt-out responses as children do. And similarly, we see that non-human primates and other monkeys engage in information search too. I just brought a video because I don't know how many of you work with chimpanzees, for example. So this is a video of a study by Jan Engelmann and his colleagues where you see that the chimp engages in this information-seeking behavior before she decides which bucket she wants to have. And in this video, she makes use of a tool in order to get this sneak peek into the bucket. All right. So this indicates that humans and non-human species share simple and mainly implicit forms of metacognitive insight. However, as for example, Carruthers, the philosopher, points out, these abilities could also be explained by first-order cognitive processes. So the problem might be that these procedural metacognitive abilities might not be truly metacognitive after all. So what follows from this stricter notion of defining metacognition, we should probably look at declarative metacognition for our case today. So what does the literature reveal about the development of declarative forms? Well, one milestone that several studies report relatively consistently is that 3-year-old children correctly claim to know something that they either saw before or were being told by the experimenter. So they seem to have this, so they seem to be able to understand that seeing or being told leads to knowing, and also the ability to reflect on this and communicate this to the outside world. However, when we look at their ability to reflect on their own ignorance, the literature reveals a rather conflicting body of results. So on the one hand, studies report that children around the same age, so 3-year-olds, can correctly and explicitly acknowledge their own ignorance. This is the case in so-called total ignorance tasks, where the children have no idea whatsoever what is inside a box, for example. And in these scenarios, they can acknowledge their own ignorance. On the other hand, and now we come to this interesting however part, we see that 3 to 6-year-old children display a striking pattern of overconfidence. So they seem, or a large body of literature reveals that they seem to overestimate themselves in various regards. For example, as regarding their own state of knowledge. I don't know if you have kids on your own, but maybe you can agree with this, that they have this striking tendency to be overconfident. Now, this leads many authors to the assumption that they don't have this declarative metacognitive insight, but that they lack crucial epistemic insight and understanding. Most importantly for today, this overconfidence shows when children fail to acknowledge their own ignorance. So this would be the case in so-called partial exposure tasks. And I want to illustrate this partial exposure task with the example of, oh no, now it works. So with the example of Rova, Klo, and Perna's study. I don't know if Josef Perna is joining us via Zoom, but I want to illustrate this in more detail because this lays the foundation for our own study. So what did they do? Remember that 3-year-old children are able to acknowledge their own ignorance in these total ignorance tasks. So when the experimenter asks them about the content of the box, then they can correctly deny their knowledge. Now, the partial exposure task is only slightly different. So the only difference is that the experimenter shows the children a set of possible objects before the hiding event. So in this scenario, in this partial exposure scenario, the children, suddenly claim to know which one of these two objects is hidden inside the box. All right, so let me summarize this and look at when declarative metacognition emerges on this kind of time scale. So we have this great tension, right? We have the total ignorance findings that point to this 3-year-old milestone, and then we have partial exposure findings, which cluster around this 6-year milestone. And this tension, yeah, is just remarkable. So how can we resolve this tension? It could be that some of these studies underestimate young children's actual metacognitive abilities. So the interesting question now is, why would they underestimate it? And one option could be the following, namely that these experiments are typically conducted in an individualistic test context. So this might be problematic because metacognition reveals itself most clearly in a social and cooperative context. So the idea would be very similar to the one by Meyer and Sperber's social theory of reasoning, where they propose that it is a discursive context that is necessary to study human reasoning. So let's look at the social perspective on metacognition too. Well, the social perspective can involve very strong claims or more modest claims. And well, I personally cannot say much about the evolutionary or more ultimate reading of it. So yeah, I'm sorry, but I cannot answer the questions whether metacognition is truly social in its origin. But I do want to address the social relevance of it. So as many authors point out, metacognition does not only serve individualistic purposes, but it fulfills important social functions. So in a more proximate meaning, the social perspective reveals this pivotal link between metacognition and social interaction and cooperation. Now, I want to illustrate this important relationship by explaining the dual system framework proposed by Shea and colleagues. They distinguish system 1 metacognition from system 2 metacognition, where system 1 enables intrapersonal cognitive control, and system 2 allows suprapersonal control as well as cooperation. I adapted a figure from the paper which was published in the Trends of Cognitive Sciences. So we see here in system 1 that its basic function is the monitoring and control of cognitive processes within the same individual. So if we go back and consider the procedural findings reviewed earlier, we could explain them on this level. So within the same individual, it would be enough to, I don't know, to monitor that I don't have the information and just know how I get more information. So this would be it here. But we won't find declarative forms here because according to Shea and colleagues, it is only system 2 that represents the metacognitive insight in such an explicit way that it is available for verbal report. And this is the main function of system 2, namely to communicate the individual's metacognitive representations to another social being. And this in turn allows the suprapersonal control and cooperation to take place. So in other words, we can engage in complex social interaction and we can cooperate successfully with others if we can select and broadcast specific metacognitive representations to our interaction partner. And this is what brings us directly to our study's rationale, because if we consider this important link between metacognition and social interaction, we argue that the individualistic test contexts of former experiments neglect this social relevance, and as a result, underestimate children's actual metacognitive abilities. So this notion that cooperation requires and entails commitment to monitoring as well as broadcasting one's own epistemic states to the other person leads to our aim, which was to introduce a social paradigm to test this. So we created a paradigm in which the children were able to interact, communicate, and cooperate with another person as naturally as possible. And with that, the idea or hypothesis would be that we could find earlier declarative metacognitive abilities in their development. All right. So what did we do? We tested 3- and 5-year-old children, a total of 66 children, and created a task within subject design. So this means that each child participated in both conditions, both the test and the control condition, which were partial exposure and full exposure condition. I will come back to that in a second. And already to mention that each child participated in 2 trials per condition. Now, as I said, we used Rova and Panna and Klo's task as a starting point, and therefore created a hiding task as well. So basically, an object gets hidden inside a box. We had these 3 toy animals, which were covered in blue paint. So this blue color actually means something here. And in each trial, the experimenter randomly selected one of those animals and hid it or placed it inside a box. And this box was 3-sided. So the side at the very end, at the back, which we cannot see here, was completely opaque, so intransparent, whereas the side here contained a transparent window, and on this side here contained a blurred window. So something like you might know from bathrooms. So yeah, so through this window, you could see that there was something bluish inside, but you couldn't identify the hidden object. All right, now the children completed 2 trials per condition. So for the full exposure condition, they sat in front of this transparent window where they had full visual access to the content of the box. And for the partial exposure condition, they sat in front of this blurred window. Yeah. The most important difference now to the task of former studies is that it was not the experimenter who asked the metacognitive test question, but we had a second experimenter involved. Let's call her a confederate, who sat at this 3rd side of the box. And yeah, now the experimenter explained that she would hide one of these 3 toy animals inside the box, and that the confederate would have to say which one it is in order to be rewarded with a sticker. If she would be incorrect, then she would not receive the sticker. And then, as I already said, this is very important, this is crucial, the experimenter left the scene. And it was only after that that the confederate would now interact with the child and ask the metacognitive test question. Crucially, this test question was embedded in a social interaction that was created as naturally as possible. So the confederate would say something like, oh, I really want to get this right. So I can't see which animal it is, but I really want to get the sticker. And then she said, she would turn to the child for help and ask the first test question, which would be, can you tell me which animal it is? And notice that this is quite natural language. Then she would react accordingly to what the child answered. So if the child, and only if the child gave advice, she would pose a second test question, which would be something like, you think it's the lion? Are you sure? If the children didn't offer any advice because they said, for example, I cannot see it or I don't know, then this second test question was not asked. We obtained both verbal and nonverbal responses of the children to these 2 test questions, but for time reasons and because it's more explicit, I will concentrate on reporting the verbal answers only today. Yeah, so I brought some examples with me. So what we coded as uncertainty was, in response to the first test question, something like maybe, or other keywords like it could be this, or it could be that, or I think it is, as well as something like I don't know, or I can't see it. Then in response to the second test question, we would have anything that involves a no or not really. So remember, are you sure? No would be uncertainty. As well as here in this example, if the child said, originally, I think it's a lion, and then after the second test question, she would shift in her decision and say, oh, or it's the sheep. So then this would be uncertainty too. All right, so let's talk about the results. Just to be clear here, I will narrow my reports down again, so I will concentrate on our findings on this first test question, because this is the most direct approach in this natural interactive context, which would provide the children's initial declarative metacognitive answers. All right, so again, I brought some videos with me so you can imagine how this looked with our children. So I have subtitles, but you could try to understand also the tone in which the children said something. So this is a 3-year-old girl participating in the partial exposure condition. So she sits in front of the blurred window and doesn't have good visual access. And she says something like this.
Kannst du mir sagen, welches Tier das ist? Ich weiß es leider nicht.
So she even almost apologizes for not knowing what animal it is in this box. Just for contrasting reasons, here's...
Kannst du mir sagen, welches Tier das ist? Ist das Schaf. Ah, du denkst, es ist das Schaf. Bist du dir sicher?
Sorry, so just for contrasting, inside, this is a 3-year-old boy who sits in the control condition in front of the transparent window and is really sure that he sees the sheep. All right. Then also a 5-year-old girl, again in the partial exposure condition, and it goes like this.
Kannst du mir sagen, welches Tier das ist?
Vielleicht das Schaf.
Ah, du denkst, es ist das Schaf. Bist du dir sicher?
So you could argue this is maybe even a more elaborate, because she also correctly denies her or correctly acknowledges her uncertainty in response to the second test question. All right, now let's talk about the results. I want to take a second here and make sure that I properly explain the figure. So what we see on the x-axis here are the conditions for 3 and for 5-year-old children, so the full versus partial exposure condition. And on the y-axis, we have the children's uncertainty score. Now, if you remember, each child participated in 2 trials per condition, so an uncertainty score of 2 would mean that they expressed uncertainty in both trials. An uncertainty score of 1 would mean that they expressed uncertainty in 1 of the 2 trials, and 0, of course, in none of the trials. Now, what we would expect, at least for the 5-year-old children, would be something like hardly any uncertainty in the full exposure condition. So this should be like somewhere here, and then much more uncertainty in the partial exposure condition. And this is what we found. So I brought these descriptive statistics here with me. So 88% of children succeeded in the full exposure condition, and 80% acknowledged their uncertainty in at least 1 of the 2 trials in the test condition. Now, you might notice that these lines between the bubbles, they show the individual pattern between conditions. So you see that the greatest fraction of those children who did not express uncertainty in the full exposure condition did express uncertainty in both trials of the partial exposure condition. All right. Now, the 3-year-old children, or for the 3-year-old children, we found a rather similar pattern. So again, they succeeded in this full exposure condition, and they did acknowledge uncertainty in the partial exposure condition. So about 1/3 did not. So they showed this tendency to overestimate themselves, but 2/3 did express uncertainty in at least one of the 2 trials. And this is actually pretty cool because like based on the previous studies, you wouldn't expect something like this. So you would expect like more this pattern. All right. Of course, we tested this for statistical significance, and it was the case that both 3- and 5-year-old children expressed significantly more uncertainty in the partial exposure condition as compared to the full exposure condition. All right, so just as an interesting side note, I wanted to bring this video with me of the same 3-year-old guy that we already saw before, because we found that some children justified their answers. And I think this just illustrates quite nicely the close relationship between metacognition and then this discursive and social character of human interaction, right? So for giving reasons for one's own states of knowledge or their behavior in reporting their states of knowledge. So in this case, he sits in front of the transparent window. So this is the control condition where he justifies his answer why he is being certain.
Der Löwe, bist du dir sicher?
Sehe das aus dem Fenster.
So he's quite proud that he sees it through the window. And there were some children who justified their answers also in front of the blurred window, but unfortunately they, I couldn't show them because they didn't agree to presentation, use of the video for presentations. All right, so let me summarize and conclude what we found. So we saw that 3- and 5-year-old children did acknowledge their ignorance in the partial exposure condition and in fact communicated uncertainty. We argue that this is because the metacognitive test question was embedded in this natural social interaction, which allowed this communicative context. And this required the children to carefully monitor their own epistemic states and also allowed them to do so and to broadcast their states of knowledge to their interaction partner. And again, this stands in contrast with prior results about their failure to acknowledge their own uncertainty. So, I forgot that. So we think that the former studies individualistic test context might underestimate their declarative metacognitive abilities and explains our contrasting findings. Of course, there remain many open questions, but we did take a first step into testing whether a social context would be more appropriate for testing young children's metacognitive development. And maybe yes, a context that allows discursive and cooperative social interaction seems to enhance their epistemic insight, or at least facilitates their ability to communicate uncertainty. Okay, as I said, there are many more open questions. Just to name a few, what would happen if we increase the ecological validity? So what if we design even more natural settings? Because of course, this is still in a laboratory setting. So what would happen if we test this in peer groups or with siblings or fellow students in educational settings? So this might be a very interesting question for further studies, as well as increasing or further increasing the relevance So yeah, remember that in our task, it depended on the child's answer whether the Confederate would get this sticker or not, but what happens if we increase the costs for incorrect advice in this case. So I don't know, if she not only not receives the sticker, but also gets punished in a like other manner, more meaningful. So what happens if we, yeah, just tune up the, the costs? And then, as I said, many others. Yeah, and with that, thank you very much for your attention. And of course, special thanks to all the people involved in this.
All right, let's remove the screen share, see if anybody out in, and anybody who is out viewing from afar, if you want to ask a question, just indicate that with a Q. I actually see somebody there. In fact, can you hit, who was that?
That's
there?
Joseph Perner.
Oh, it's Joseph Perner. Actually, let's start with Joseph.
Okay, thank you. That was really interesting, but the most interesting thing I didn't get the data on. Well, was there a difference between the transparent and the opaque screen?
Yes, there was. Yeah, so they did express uncertainty in front of the, I'm sorry, you mean the third side and the blurred window? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a good point. We didn't test that in our first experiment, but we're planning on including this control condition in a follow-up study that we're already planning, but is pausing due to COVID. So yeah, that would be very nice to contrast whether that would make a difference. So yeah,
Okay.
I totally get that point.
Understand that the data you showed us were all from the transparent screen.
No, sorry. So the cases in which the children expressed uncertainty were when they were sitting in front of the blurred window. So where they couldn't see which animal was inside the box, they only saw that there was something bluish.
Yeah, okay. No, sorry. I understood that the opaque screen, okay, so one screen was blurred and the other one was clear, transparent.
Yes.
Okay. I thought one was opaque and the other one was blurred.
Yeah, no, the windows which the children
okay.
in front of were transparent versus blurred.
Okay. So the transparent screen is the control condition. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And the questions you had, the children are asked genuinely by the Confederate, can you tell me what's in there? Okay, so
can you tell me which animal it is?
Yeah, okay. And then if they answered with an animal, then the question was, can you be sure?
Yes, are you sure?
Okay. So the first question, can you tell me, isn't really metacognitive necessarily, because they could simply judge whether they can answer or not, but that's not strictly metacognitive. But the second judgment, that is metacognitive, right? And the data you showed us is whether they gave a metacognitive indication to the second question by saying maybe, or the,
Yeah. So thank you for that comment. I mean, I think I get your point, but I also think that one could argue whether this more natural wording of this metacognitive insight could count as explicitly metacognitive, because Yeah, because it does require the children to like explicitly represent whether they know that or not.
Well, yeah, okay. That may be or maybe not the case, or?
Yeah. But yeah, we also have a second follow-up study in which the test question is much more similar to yours. So where we ask them, do you know which animal is inside the box?
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be very interesting to contrast again. Yeah. And like my intuition would be that this might be similar. So the results might be similar to the ones that we use with this metacognitive test question. Yeah, but of course that is an open question, and yeah, we have to check this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just try to be clear about what you think about the relationship between social communication and metacognition, because you talk about broadcasting, which would suggest that metacognition must be in place before the social communication happens. But it seems to me that also you said things which indicated that the interaction might be partly or wholly constitutive of metacognition. So what's your view, please?
Yeah, I think I have to be careful on this one because I cannot draw like causal relations from this one tiny study, but the idea is that because of this social context and because this cooperative nature of this social context, it is both necessary and easier for the child to reflect on their epistemic states or on their state of knowledge and then represent this and broadcast it like explicitly. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think yes.
Okay, thanks.
I think Ulf had something.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting talk. I was wondering about the results. So you reported two significance tests, and you had, I think, effect sizes for that on there as well. I guess the R was the effect size, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it is not this Pearson correlation coefficient, but it is another one. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's somehow a little bit like D, right? So it was in the 0.7s, which would be a pretty big effect size for a D, or for an R squared or something like that.
Yeah,
so, but my question is that you tested in the 3-year-olds and in the 5-year-olds the full exposure versus the partial exposure. Did you also test the partial exposures of the 5-year ones against the partial exposures of the 3-year ones, so between subjects? And do you have an effect size for that, and significant results for that as well?
Unfortunately, I don't have the effect sizes for that, but we did test this and it was not significant. So not significantly different from each other.
That is a great result, right? Because that means that you would actually then say that there's already the whole metacognition ability of the 5-year-old in the 3-year-old.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, I mean, there need to be lots more studies and of course more control conditions, but yeah.
It's good news for 3-year-olds.
Actually, this was one of my other questions. Do you have any covariates, anything that you controlled for in those tests? So like for example, intelligence or something like that?
No, we haven't, unfortunately. So we didn't collect any data on their general intelligence. But that would be like pretty easy to add. So yeah, so I will discuss that with my colleagues. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
Right, thank you for your talk. Yeah, I have a question that's kind of maybe also related to the covariates and what you were talking about as well as the relevance of the knowledge. because I was thinking, to what extent might like having of not knowing or knowing that you're not knowing, and like some sort of not wanting to admit that you're not knowing might play a role in the answers that especially if you say that the 3 to 6 year olds, well, it wasn't a result in your study, but in other studies, it seems like the older you are, the more you realize, I don't want to admit that I don't know something, or so I would say maybe it's very interesting to take that into account and maybe test for some sort of social desirability in
Totally. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's a very good point. And I think it's one of the reasons we thought that this might be a bigger problem in an individualistic test context. So imagine I am the experimenter and I'm hiding one of 2 objects inside like this box. And then I ask you, so do you know which one it is or do you not know? And this might be even harder, or the pressure might be up that the child doesn't want to be stupid and doesn't want to admit that she doesn't know. Maybe also because the child understands it as a guessing game. So that would be another aspect maybe. But yeah, that we tried to involve this naive second experimenter, so our confederate, which didn't know either. We thought this could like help with this problem you addressed, so that they wouldn't be too afraid of not admitting that they didn't know. And also because the confederate relied on them, right? So she was in need of the child's correct assessment.
Yeah, so then if you would want to isolate like this metacognition, it would also be interesting to see like if the mother asks or a friend asks or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
Right. Yeah, thanks.
Hey, oh, who do we have up here? Jenny.
Oh, hi. Yeah. So thanks a lot for the talk. I've really enjoyed it. So I think like my question is not quite like a question, is to do with like future directions, like and I think some of the things you've already mentioned, which is like the sort of like variables that you might have to control. So I was actually thinking about a version of Jean Piaget's study on children that was done in 1999, and like it seems that when you put like children in pairs and when they are left to discuss matters on their own, they tend to arrive at a more accurate judgment at the end of the discussion. So like, the sort of like social aspect, putting them in a discussive environment seems to have like, certain effect on the way they arrive at certain judgment, which is good news for you and your experiment, I think. But I suppose like the question is like kind of like related to what some people have asked already, like, what does that tell us exactly? So like in the context of your study, like, what are some of the very concrete signs of social metacognition, instead of like just like some sort of like social abilities to arrive at like maybe more accurate judgments or whatever. So just wondering what you think about that.
I'm sorry, I have to admit that you were a bit too fast. Could you repeat like the gist of your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, sorry. I tend to talk quite fast. So I'm just wondering, so like given that there has been studies that show that if you put children in groups, they could arrive at like better more accurate judgments just in virtue of the fact that they get to like interact with one another. I'm thinking that like, as compared to your study, what are some of the things in your study, in the setup and design of your study, that show us that these are about social metacognition instead of like just like social factors playing a positive role in driving towards like better judgments or whatever?
Okay, I think I got your question. If I don't answer it properly, just get back to me. So I think so following this notion that metacognition is especially important for successful cooperation in a like social cooperative fashion, then this would mean that, okay, sorry, let me start again. So if both parties don't know how to achieve a certain goal or uncertain, then they should carefully like reflect on that and discuss it with one another in order to, like Mercier and Sperber said, or for the reasoning that like 2 heads are better than 1, so that they should broadcast the individuals' representations and then discuss them in the hope that they can come to the best conclusion if they communicate about their own metacognitive representations. And this, yeah, I'm not sure, no pun intended, but I think this could be like different from other cases of social practices. So if I don't need to say whether I know or don't know, then there's no metacognition per se involved. But if the success depends on this assessment of one's own certainty or uncertainty, then there should be metacognition involved.
Okay, so the idea is that it hinges a lot on expressing uncertainty, expressing that you don't know, and expressing that you could. Well, that's supposed to be something that implies that you are meta representing about like certain states that you're uncertain about. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
All righty. Well, I remind folks out here that they can corner our speaker later. And we have reached the end of our canonical time. So let's give our speaker, Marlene, a round of applause. Preston, do you have any announcements for?